Well, welcome to Scenarios Planning. My name is Debbie Cook. I'm the mayor of Huntington Beach, California, and also a board member on ASPO. We're really pleased to have you here today. I have been working in this area for the last 3 years trying to figure out how to get communities to understand that they need to deal with this issue. And after 3 years of a lot of hard work, made some inroads, but at the same time, I realized that it's an exercise in trying to get human behavior changed, and therein lies the real challenge. It was funny earlier, maybe it wasn't funny for you, those of you who were sitting in this room earlier when the music got really loud next door, but I was among the people who ran next door to see if we could get them to turn it down, and I ran smack into my sister-in-law, who was one of those over there singing. So, it just goes to show you, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. But irrespective, it takes all kinds in this world, and how you reach those people is different depending on which group you're trying to reach. I figure that the world is, kind of broken into fifths. You've got the 1/5 who get it, the 1/5 that are never going to get it, and then the 3/5 are the ones that we're trying to work on and see if we can get somewhere and move forward and educate those people. We have a tight schedule today, and obviously a lot of speakers, and I'm going to be the mean one with the timer. And our first speaker, we've actually allocated the most time to, and it's Mr. Bryn Davidson. He is a lead accredited designer and sustainability consultant holding degrees in mechanical engineering from UC Berkeley and architecture from the University of British Columbia. He is the co-founder and executive director of the Dynamic Cities Project, which is located in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he's working to develop energy transition strategies to be proactive in a peak oil world. Please welcome Bryn Davidson.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everybody, for choosing this session. I think we've got a good panel here. Looking forward to having the dialogue. As she said, the Dynamic Cities Project is focused on what I see as the two major global real game changers for planning cities and state infrastructure, and those being peak oil and climate change. And I talk about the two of those as being together the global energy transition. In terms of what I'd like to cover in my 20-minute stint here, talk a little bit, just a quick background on energy transition and why I think that framework's important. Then talk a little bit about what are some of the tipping points that are going to take us into the future, because I don't think we're going to see the sort of smooth transition to sustainability that many of us in the sort of sustainable development field often visualize. But rather, there's going to be a series of shocks that are going to bring about step changes in what we're willing to do. And then finally, I want to look at how we use scenarios to try and start to grapple with some of this uncertainty that we're dealing with regarding these two major forces that are changing our cities. So to begin with, in talking about peak oil, I've often found that sometimes it's the climate change crowd that have thrown up some of the most barriers. And likewise, there are conflicts the other way. So I've found it's helpful to try and distinguish where there's differences and when there's common ground. Of course, with peak oil, there are many potential responses, some of which we're employing today, that are potentially disastrous if you care about climate change. These, of course, being switching from gas to coal, coal to liquids, and some of the other non-conventional fuels. There's going to be a real push to scale these things up. All of these are pretty much terrible from a climate change standpoint. When you look at climate change, of course, there are many things people are proposing that we do which do nothing to reduce the oil dependence of our economies. So when we start looking at emissions trading or planting trees or some of these other strategies, they may be fine in their own right, but they do nothing to reduce the dependence of your economy to oil. So when I start looking at this, I say, okay, it's okay if you want to plant trees, but we need to prioritize those strategies which do both. Those are the things that reduce emissions and reduce the oil dependence of our cities and our economy. And I call these energy transition strategies. So now to look forward, how do we start to map out some of the things that might be coming down the pipe for us? I believe that for a long time we've known how to create sustainable cities. The technology, the strategies, there's nothing new that needs to be invented. What's simply been lacking has been the willingness to scale up these solutions. Now, of course, with changing gas prices, I think we're seeing that all of a sudden people's willingness to take on new ideas is starting to shift. So people shifting to, in this case, the guy's turning his $4 gas into a bicycle. Again, in case of rising gas prices. In terms of business models, you're looking at companies like Ford and some of these other ones that say, okay, at $4 a gallon, we're going to switch over some of our business model. We're going to stop making trucks, start making cars. So I don't know of any, I would love it if a few years ago we could have introduced climate legislation that would have brought about this same level of change. But I think that the price really is becoming a fundamental driver in how we do a lot of things. Now, of course, how well we transition is going to be determined by how well we react to these various tipping points as they unfold. So first, peak oil, global crisis for capitalism and economic growth. Climate change, ecological and humanitarian crisis, also potentially an economic crisis. This is an exciting little sound. But of course, there are some things that both of these are going to impact, and these are the things that really have an impact on the ground in our cities, in our political arenas, and these have to do with food, the economy, jobs, livability, rates of immigration. These are all the things that both peak oil and climate change will impact. And so when we start looking at scenarios for the future, we need to understand that there's an overlap, or the fact that these two forces are going to in some ways combine. And hopefully looking at scenarios will help us to grasp how this might unfold. So in looking at climate shocks, I started to break it down into a system like what you do for hurricanes, from low impact all the way through systemic collapse. I don't like to talk about the worst case scenario, but just say as an example, a mid-level climate shock, an extreme drought, which impacts your food production. Same thing on the energy side. I think there's a lot of degrees in between here and the end of industrial society, and we need to maybe talk more in a more sophisticated way about the various hurdles that we're going to come across. So in this case, a fairly probable event, some combination of events leads to a shortage of fuel. Now, if we pack these two things together, what you end up with is a potentially serious shock that has real implications in terms of maybe the availability of food, or something that has very far-reaching political implications. And I believe that these are the tipping points that are really going to change what we're willing to do, what we're willing to invest in, and what we're willing to do politically. So what I have here, and this computer has changed my font a little bit, but is to try and map out 3 scenarios then that we can use for planning when we're trying to figure out what the potential futures hold. So on one hand, there's sort of the business as usual down in the one corner. But then I think we also need to look at 2 scenarios. One I call it an accelerated turbulent transition, and one is a major shock transition. So this one, some of the things that define it, we're looking at things like government rationing, migration to places that have jobs, nationalization of resources. These are from combined impacts of peak oil and climate change. If we have slightly less bad shocks, then we might go through a change where we're defined by rising energy prices, a turbulent market, and a real shift from the sort of old school industries to the sort of growing and emerging green economies. So this is a sort of second context where I think we still have primarily market-based solutions. And we are, well, we can maybe argue about where we are today, but we're somewhere, I think, very different than where we were, say, 5 years ago. So now in terms of how do we begin to actually take these and translate them into the bricks and mortar of building our cities? When you go to any organization that's planning infrastructure, buried deep down within their organization, down at the bottom, there are these economic projections that their forecasters have created that say this is how many cars are going to be driving around in the future. And they're typically extrapolations of past trends. So in the past, it grew. So in the future, naturally, it's going to grow. This is from Washington State, a projection for vehicle miles. And of course, what this leads to is typically more of the same. So what we find is that the engineers are just building what the economists have told them they need to build. And this is really fundamental to the way we do our planning. And these projections are extremely difficult to question. This is a story from Olympia, Washington, where they're running up against the traffic engineers who says, we have to keep this road because the projection says it's going to fill up. So the question, of course, then is, what if the future is different than the past? This is an example that I found interesting from Maryland. This is a small town that went, and what they did is they invested $61 million in a new runway for their town. And the idea was it was an economic development exercise. And basically, the day, pretty close to when they finished building this runway, the airlines came and said, we're not going to move in because, fuel prices have been rising and we're actually looking at maybe contracting our operations. So what we had was a town that invested $61 million on a stranded asset. And I think this starts to be critical when we start talking about how to make resilient investments in our infrastructure, that we start looking at different futures so that we're not investing in our money in something that down the road is becoming a stranded asset. Now, so we need to make resilient investments that are valuable today, but also valuable in a world defined by peak oil and climate change. Now, why the focus on infrastructure? Here we are today, historic global oil production. A couple of future scenarios, we can argue about that one potentially, but it's going to happen something like that. And here I am, and if I have kids someday, that'll be their life relative to what's coming down the pipe. And then the thing is, next to that, there's the things that we're building today. These are the infrastructures, the land use planning, the highways, sewers, all these things that we're pouring in concrete, we're building today, will be serving us in a post-oil future. So I really see this as the first place, independent of all the uncertainty around peak oil or climate change, that we need to get this right. Because the stuff we're building today is the stuff that's going to be serving us in a future defined by real uncertainty on energy, the economy, and on the climate. So in terms of how that actually gets applied, an example of a highway expansion in British Columbia. Our province, in all their great wonder, are considering an expansion of highways as part of an economic development strategy. Now, their justification for expanding the highways comes from the trucking industry, who says truck traffic is expected to rise by 50% by 2021. Now, naturally, in just about everywhere up there, these numbers are unassailable, because how do you, okay, well, it must have come down from on high, this number. And this is being used as a justification for the expansion of highways. So what I want to do is try and say, okay, let's take that number and call it scenario 1. And next to that, I'm going to put another scenario, the two scenarios that I talked about earlier. One that addresses rising fuel prices and some of these other impacts from a turbulent transition. And one that starts to look at broader social impacts. That's a real kind of social test of if we have to go through a much deeper kind of crisis in order to transition. So then we put those three side by side. They say 50%. I say we could be down 10 or even 30% on our truck traffic. And so the question then is, looking at these side by side, how do we make the best investment, given the fact that we don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen in the future? Now, we do know where that number came from. The question is, you're probably wondering where these numbers came from, and if I was making them up in the same way that they were. To a certain extent, maybe, but I'll talk about that briefly. I want to look at truck travel, because I think this is going to be critical. In the modeling that I've done, the cars, it's not that big a deal. There's a lot of room for efficiency gains in personal vehicles. That's not the biggest problem we're facing. Our aging infrastructure and our logistics chains, I think, are going to be the real crux. So I want to look here at truck travel. Here we are using 2005 as a starting point. Business as usual, truck travel growing. And I put next to that a scenario for oil depletion, saying basically here's our supply of diesel fuel in North America decreasing in line with a certain depletion scenario. Now you're saying, okay, where does that come from? I look at historic production. There's a wide range. Then there's the ones that I tend to believe more. And from those, I've developed two scenarios that I use for planning, a slower depletion model and a faster depletion model, to use these, and then plugging these into our other scenarios. So the high scenario we can use for one test, the low scenario used for another test. So the one that I'm talking about right now is this guy here. So that's where that black line comes from. So then the question is, what do we do in terms of mitigation in response to this? Of course, we have non-conventional fuels. but these only scale up so quickly, so they come in terms of a wedge. Other wedges, biofuels, more fuel-efficient vehicles, electrification, especially electric freight rail. And then what's left over is what we have to take out of the demand side. That's the difference between business as usual and what we're actually able to do. So I look at this and I say, this is where we're going to have to buy local products, build local products, or simply do without. And so around 2020, 2030, all the modeling that I keep coming around this idea of peak local, because there's a sort of a lag time between when these motivating forces come on board and then how quickly our solutions scale up. And so there's this sort of 10, 15, 20-year period where we're kind of playing catch-up. Now, of course, when I look at then how much road capacity do we actually need for trucks? And from this model, under this scenario, we're actually down 10% in 2021. So that's where that number came from. And I start to ask the question then, is it possible that we're actually nearing peak roads? I think there's a potential that we have as much road capacity and parking capacity today as we may ever need or ever be able to use. So this is really kind of a fundamental thing when we start looking at these major issues, peak oil, climate change. How does that affect our cities that we need to wrap our heads around? Now, of course, some people might think that's crazy, but I think that's the level of the challenge that we're facing. A little bit of data maybe to back up some of that thinking. This is vehicle miles traveled on U.S. highways. I can barely see it. I don't know if you guys can even see that there. It's kind of dark on this computer. You can see it growing basically from 1983, growing continuously until right around 2005, and then just recently it just started to decline. And so we have this sort of unprecedented change in consumer behavior happening in response to prices. So that's the question then. Is new road capacity the best way to invest billions? I can't tell you exactly what the future is going to hold, but I can do a couple of scenarios and I can say, this probably isn't an investment that's going to pay us back in every future. So I think there's probably a better way that we could spend that money. So to finish up, hopefully still within my 20-minute slot, a couple things from my wish list if I was king here. I'd really like to see climate change and peak oil integrated more thoroughly, because I feel like to talk about them separately really is sticking our head in the sand from both sides. And so I think this is critical. We need to reduce emissions and reduce oil dependence. I'd really like to see ASPO or some other larger consensus-based body take some of the developed depletion scenarios, like the ones that I'm using for modeling here, and publish them to an extent that people can pick them up and say, okay, this is the best knowledge out there. Climate change has the IPCC. Peak oil needs a similar consensus-generating body, something that we as planners and designers can take as tools to really kind of get down to the nitty-gritty. Everything that's serving us past 2012 that we're investing in today, I think we need to use scenario-based planning. I think it's just silly that we would use one demand projection that was probably done 5 or 10 years ago to plan all the infrastructure, the major billions of dollars of investment that are coming down the pipe now. So past 2012, I'd say we've got to go to scenario-based planning to try and get this right. And finally, I think we need at least a minimum 10-year moratorium on new highway expansion and airport expansion. Now, I think maybe sometime down the road we could get more cars driving, but at the moment there are definitely better investments to be made. And frankly, I feel like this is the sort of front line of the whole peak oil dialogue. If we can't convince ourselves to stop expanding our highways right now, then I think basically we've lost the entire point of the conversation. So I really feel like if you're involved with infrastructure or municipal government or regional or state government, this is really the first step. And I think once that falls in line, once we've wrapped our heads around that idea, I think we can really move on towards the 10,000 other things that need to be done. And I look forward to doing it with everybody here. Thanks.
Wow, and he did it in less than 20. Thank you. I'd like to add to that peak airports, and maybe there's some other peak things, but There are literally hundreds and hundreds of councils of governments across this nation, and I think I can pretty much guarantee nobody is discussing this issue of peak roads and peak parking lots. Although I've certainly tried to interject that into the conversation on the council of government that I serve, but you get this look like you're just nuts until we hit $4 a gallon gasoline. That really was the look I got. Now people are kind of coming to me asking me for stock advice. Okay, our next speaker is Dan Bednarz, and Dan has been a virtual friend of mine for several years. We've been emailing each other back and forth, so this is the first time we've actually had an opportunity to meet. And Dan has actually been working in the area, the intersection between energy and healthcare. He's written a number of really interesting papers on the subject, and so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say in 10 minutes. Thank you. Here's Dan.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm looking forward to what I can say in 10 minutes, too. Let me just give you, I want to give you an overview of our health system and make a couple of points. First of all, we have a public health system, which most people don't pay attention to, and unless there's a food outbreak or you want to send someone for an STD test or something. But the public health system is what's really most important, because it's about prevention, and it's about population-level health. And then you have a healthcare system, which is about treatment, clinical medicine, and people who basically are sick or have medical conditions. For every $1 spent in the country on health by the government, 1 cent goes to public health, and 99 goes to treatment medicine. I think that will change. It will have to change. So we have these two systems. In many countries, they're integrated. In this country, they're basically not. Public health is pretty much the stepchild, and you rarely hear anything about it. Now, I want to tell you what's up in public health, as far as I know, regarding energy, peak oil. And I do share the position that you have to address climate change and peak oil simultaneously. I'm not going to talk about that, but I think it's important, especially with hospitals, because they create a lot of greenhouse gases. Okay, so in public health, there's a little bit of good news, and that is that the CDC has funded a conference that's going to be held at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health next March called After Peak Oil. So we're busy planning that now. As a former academic, I can understand people being jaded, like, oh boy, another conference, whoop-de-doo. But this is going to bring, for a lot of people in public health, it's the kind of legitimization they need, because someone like me who says things to them, they say, oh, that's very interesting, but gee, it's not in the journals. So this is the top school of public health in the country, and the CDC's funding it. Is it enough? Probably not, but we just keep going, doing what we can. So that is good. And then the CDC is aware of this issue. There's not a lot they can do, but they're funding this. They have those of you who know, it's highly sensitive politically at the CDC, whatever they do. But it is a beginning. In terms of medicine, it's a quite different story. In fact, we had a conference call planning with Hopkins last week, and the consensus was pretty much medicine is going to lag far, far behind. And they are lagging far behind. Why? Because they're concerned. Medicine is big bureaucracy. It's about medical complexes, large hospitals, health industry. They're certainly concerned about energy and energy cost, even though energy is only about, as of 2000, it was about 1.5% of a typical hospital budget. Obviously, that's gone up now. We don't know how much, but it's gone up. And they're very concerned about energy, but they're looking at it in terms of operations, not in terms of strategy. So what does that mean? 1, they think it's temporary. 2, they think it's somebody else's problem. So 3, they're not, the top level is not addressing it. So I'm at the point now where instead of being ignored, I'm now getting emails from some executives saying, I want to assure you we're working on this. I don't think they are, but they are moving in that direction. What is happening in medicine, I occasionally speak at medical schools, and I talk to staff like intensive care, doctors in surgery, and they're worried, especially after this summer. Ambulance drivers have come to them and said, how are we supposed to drive these ambulances when we get 7 miles to a gallon and we're paying $5 a gallon for diesel? Most of them, if not all of them, rely on just-in-time shipping of medical equipment. They have no warehouse capabilities. And they're saying, what is going to happen if there are transportation interruptions, and on and on. The Red Cross is experiencing problems at two ends. One is they have a FedEx model, that is, you go out and you gather the blood and you ship it to a central location where it's warehoused, and then you ship it back. Well, that model is breaking down. Secondly, a lot of the donors, because a lot of people like to donate frequently, are saying, you know what, I can't afford to drive to do this anymore. You have some other way? Can you give me a stipend or something, or remunerate me? So there are these signs coming from the middle and from the bottom in medicine, and it's becoming volatile. So what's going to happen? Well, after what happened last week, I think the healthcare that healthcare in this country is in very serious trouble, because even without peak oil, as most of you know, it's in very bad financial shape. Now, it's been going along, eating up 15, 16, 17, I think it's around 18 or 19% of the GDP now, but also running on debt, because most top administrators at hospital complexes want to build and buy, and they don't want to hear about cutting back. And most people I talk to in hospitals tell me there's at least 15, 25, maybe as much as 30, 40% fat that they could cut out. I see the system coming into crisis because the government's going to come into crisis. There'll be less money, and then we'll have, as a society, a number of choices to make. I wish that the medical leaders were treating this as a strategic issue. They're not yet, but things are so volatile and unstable that can turn around very quickly. So there are two basic outcomes that I see. One is you're going to strengthen the public health system, which will protect population-level health, but the medical system is going to have to contract, and probably contract severely. Another outcome is that you simply have a two-tiered system, one for the elite who's got money and they get their medical care, and then you basically have triage for the rest of the population. I know that has implications about democracy and all that, and I'm not going to go into that, but those are, as I see it, the two options, especially after what has happened this week. It is the case that healthcare is too important to fail. We've heard a lot of that in the past few weeks. But the other side of this is most people in healthcare say to me, well, look, we're recession-proof and we're needed. And I say to them, but you're not peak oil-proof. And they really don't understand that yet. The realization is beginning at the local level because the people are actually experiencing the shortages or the complaints or anticipating what might happen. How am I doing, Deb?
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Oh, I could take questions. Yeah, I know, I'm just teasing. So, and of course this, this has implications, as has been pointed out, for the health of our society going forward. I think a lot of people I meet and they say, what are you doing? Energy and health. And then we talk and they say, oh, I never thought about that. Look at all the resources, especially petroleum-based resources, that are flowing into hospitals. And most of them are being made overseas. Syringes, lubrications, gels, pharmaceuticals. And maybe it's not so much cumulatively, although I think it is, but when you talk about interruptions and oil shocks, then it becomes a very serious issue. So I think I'll end here. I think I did what I wanted to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is Terry Backer, And he is now a state representative for Stratford in Connecticut, and I think he served for like 20 years, something like that. And he's also worked with Soundkeeper on Long Island Sound for also 20 years. And I'm told that he is quite the peak oil guy in the legislature back there. And I can see why. Who'd want to go up against this guy? Okay, Terry?
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be a little bit of a skunk at the picnic. I'm going to talk about politics. We're here having choir practice, many of us, and we have choir practice day after day, week after week, whether we're doing it online or someplace else. If we want to make forward motion on this issue, we're going to have to start influencing decision makers. Choir practice is not enough. Sharpening your encyclopedia of facts and figures is not enough to move this forward. I was asked to talk a little bit about how we managed to form a peak oil caucus in the Connecticut legislature, how we were able to move it, create a planning scenario bill that passed with only one vote against it, and then have the governor sign it, and the RFP will be chosen this week. Contractor will be selected to go out and plan for higher prices, short-term and long-term disruptions of oil for the state of Connecticut, which is a small state, but it has 3.5 million people. It's pretty crowded. And it's still very, very energy dependent. We have no native source of fuel except trees, and they would all be gone pretty quickly this winter if there were no oil or natural gas there. So the reason why I said I'm going to be a skunk at the picnic, when you're trying to accomplish something in a legislative venue, whether it's the town council, the state legislature, or Congress, mixing issues can be deadly. If you bring climate change to the table with peak oil, you have already defeated yourself in the legislature. I don't mean to say that they're not two sides of the same coin. We get it. But there's lots of people who don't. In my particular caucus, I'm a Democrat, most of the Democrats buy climate change. I have 60 or so Republicans who kind of get it, but they don't want to talk about it. So we had to create a group of people that would work together to do something about peak oil production. So the first thing we did is, we didn't have to do this, but you're going to have to do this. You have to find someone in your legislative body, wherever it is, who has the credibility to bring the issue forward. I was appropriations chairman for 16 years. I was the energy chair for 4 till the speaker fired me because I didn't support him for his speakership. I'll be back. You have to bring someone with credibility to the table. That person has to know how to move a bill through the legislature. It's not that you bring it up and it's a good idea. You have to start recruiting people to support you. And the way I recruited people to support us is, first I picked one senator who was a close friend of mine. In fact, when he was a junior in college, he was one of my campaign managers, who later became a senator. I said, Bobby, I want you to read this. He came back and said, what are we going to do? So I got one guy in the House and one guy in the Senate. And we put together with the board members of ASPO to come together and put on a peak oil forum, which I think eventually, through the several hours of it, over 50 legislators attended it. They attended it because Bobby and I asked them to come personally. We called them up and we said, we'd like you to stop by for an hour. This is all politics or personal relationships. You have to get the people who have the credibility and the people who can talk about it. We didn't talk about Mad Max. We didn't talk about Armageddon. We didn't talk about everybody starving. What we talked about is the impact on our economy, the impact on the people of the state and their ability to buy food, their ability to get to work, the GDP of the state, how it would affect unemployment, how each dollar increase in oil affected the economy of the state and therefore the people of the state. They understand that. They get it. You may have an overwhelming need to drive your philosophy through, to get them to understand what's really going on. Don't do it. Just don't do it. You will make more progress by speaking the same language as the people you're talking to. Now look at newspaper people look at tomorrow's headline. The stock folks, the masters of the universe over on Wall Street, wait for the next piece of news for the next sale. Corporate guys look for the quarter, for the next set of the next quarter income. Politicians look to the next election. And if you're going to get out there and ask them to look forward 5, 10, 15 years, you're going to find very few takers, because it is a dangerous game to play if you want to get reelected. Most people just don't want to get reelected because they want to. They're working on complicated issues like health care and education. They're passionate about those things, and they feel that they're the ones who need to do it. But they're not going to take a chance on an issue they don't understand. Talking about peak oil to them, in the context that many of us see it as, is like saying the Mayan calendar says the world will end in 2012. Now, you have to do something about that. I want you to do something about that, and you'll do it now. No one believes it, and no one's going to do it. Strategy, tactics are the way you move something through a legislature. It's the way you move something through a town council. You can't pick the one legislator who is out there on the far fringe of Venus on everything and expect them to convince the conservatives or the non-believers someplace else. You have to find someone who can speak their language, who understands what you want them to do. All the choir practice in the world is not going to change this. Now, it's kind of interesting because I have an airport expansion I'm fighting in my town for a number of years, 2 new runways. I also have 2 new parking garages I've been trying to get them not to build in the community I live in. It hasn't even gotten through to the planners. We managed, by putting on a very, very good forum with people you all know, and we managed to convince the folks that were in that room that they should join and stay in the peak oil caucus. Then Bobby and I did a quick turnaround on a report, which was about 2 weeks. I think I sat up every night till about 2 in the morning writing the damn thing. And we got it out, and we did a press conference on it, and we sent it out to every legislator, and we hand-delivered it to all the leaders of the caucus and the governor saying, would you please read this for us? And when they read it, I got a call back from the governor, and she said to me, Terry, I'm going to assign someone from the Office of Policy and Management to work with you on this. Please don't frighten everybody. It frightened her when she read it. And it was a very mild, from my take, report on what happens as oil prices change or as oil availability changes. So what I think we all need to do, now if you're here in a planning factor or you're here as an academic, maybe you have a different role. If you're here as an activist, as a person who thinks we need to ring this alarm and do more than ring the alarm, start things to happen, then you need to drive the process politically because that's what happens. Or we can sit around and wait. I particularly don't want to sit around and wait. My kids are older now. I got a 22-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a 16-year-old. But there are other children that I would like to see benefit. Part of what also worked very well for us was our resident economists in the bodies. There's always a couple of them who are the best economists in the world who serve in the legislature. And he said, well, Terry, you're going to get demand destruction, and the demand's going to go down, the price is going to bounce back and forth. And, you really got to understand this. Well, I'm not Adam Smith. I'm not Milton, what's his name? But I kind of did get it, except what he didn't get is that they stopped paying taxes on the gas they weren't buying. So what roads are we going to fix? What bridges? We have a D rating on our infrastructure in the state. So demand destruction is happening in the state. And what happened? Our transportation coffers are falling to almost zero, which I believe is also true of the U.S. Transportation Fund, which is now, I think they're over there looking for about $1 billion along with everybody else in the country. So demand destruction is not necessarily the way we want to go to solve this problem, because in and of itself, it creates a lot of other very, very difficult problems for all of us in terms of employment. I have a large immigrant community where I live. Most of them, many of them can't read, many of them can't speak English, yet they do service jobs. Those service jobs are vanishing as I speak. No one's paying someone to cut their lawn when they're looking at heating bills using heating oil this winter at $1,000 or $1,500 for the winter. So the service jobs are disappearing. The gas stations, we've got 3 gas stations closed in our town. I think they're Exxon stations. I think they're getting out of the business of oil, by the way. I'm not quite sure of it yet, but I think they're on their way out. So nonetheless, strategy is important. Finding the right person to carry the message. Having that person work the system in a way that it needs to be worked. One, presenting information. We presented the information. We managed to get the bill passed. The bill then created a planning scenario bill, which has a number of factors in it, and you can find it online someplace. But basically, it looks at the implications and the impacts on the state services. And someone said, well, why aren't you doing the whole community? I said, because the state's the largest employer. It's the largest group who houses people. It's the largest group who feeds people. It has the largest transportation system. If you look enough at the state, you have captured the whole population at the same time. It then goes on to allow for 3 subcategories to have special interest in. It could be healthcare, it could be transportation, kind of picking 3 very large group pieces out of that to analyze that. When that's done, whoever the contractor will be on that will return a report to us. I managed to get myself appointed chairman of the peak oil task force, so that task force will then make recommendations to the body. You're not going to convince them that the world ends in 2012 without facts, and they get facts every day, because API's got that ad on television about the 60 million cars and the 160 million houses for 60 years that we have enough oil for. And it's going to be American oil. It's going to be used in the United States. So our colleagues and our constituents are being bombarded by messages that let them relax about this issue. Well, we're going to solve this problem. The Congress is going to let us drill offshore. They're bombarded with the snapshot solutions that they want. No one wants things to change. Things have looked pretty good for 70 or 80 years based on the fossil fuel economy. And this brought us great prosperity. And we know it's changing. But we're not going to change unless we get through the state legislatures. I believe the path to Washington is through the state legislatures, one at a time. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Terry. Obviously, your passion also helps you, and the fact that you have a basis in knowledge and facts that also help you as you move forward. But it's just another demonstration that, you know, people do things for their reasons, not for our reasons, and we have to figure out what their reasons are. And in most cities, it's really about money. Our next speaker is going to maybe take this another step further, because what I have found when I finally convinced an elected official that this really is an issue, the next question out of their mouth is, okay, what do I do? And so our next speaker is John Kaufmann, who is a senior policy analyst with the Oregon Department of Energy, and I know he's spent a lot of time in figuring out what next. John.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Glad to be here. I'm going to show a couple of slides, but I am going to talk a little bit first. First of all, I agree with everything these guys have said. Question comes up, you know, I talked to the group last year. I was at the ASPO conference last year. I talked about Portland. I was lead staff to the Portland task force. I was lead author of the report. And thought I'd come in and talk a little bit about what Portland's done. I'm often asked the question, what has Portland done? What is the state doing? So I just want to cover that real briefly and then get into some of the slides that I've got. The reason I want to mention, I mean, Portland has taken the lead here, but the approach, other than Portland appointing the task force, is slightly different than I think what is taken perhaps in Connecticut, perhaps in Massachusetts, where it's more they've gone through the legislature and are coming from the top down. We have been approaching it a little bit more from the bottom up in Oregon.
I'm sorry, I'm going to sneak in here.
Oh, you're going to find that. We've kind of been taking it more from the bottom up. Now, Portland did the task force last year. They came up with some recommendations, but what they're actually doing to implement it right now is actually on the ground. What do you do? And they've given for example, they've given $150,000 to the Portland Department of Transportation to integrate peak oil into the transportation plan. They have given $75,000 to, I'm sorry, I draw a blank on which agency it is, to incorporate food, you know, local agriculture into this city food policy plan. And they have incorporated peak oil into their visioning plan. What is the city going to look like in 50 years? And they've identified peak oil and global warming as 2 of the 4 main things that are going to drive the future for the city. And that really shapes, you know, the planning documents for the city and some of the other plans. Now, at the state level, we've kind of taken a different approach. Like I say, we're not going with the task force approach. What we're doing there is, you know, large part of it is coming from me, large part of it, you know, is from some of my colleagues at the state. We're trying to work through bottom-up, kind of a bottom-up approach, let it filter from the bottom. So we're going out and making a lot of presentations. We're making presentations to a lot of state agencies and to a lot of influential groups out in the community. I mean, do the standard stuff. You know, we've talked to the League of Women Voters, talked to the Rotary Clubs, you know, we've talked to different associations, Cattlemen's Association, Poultry Association. I mean, it's eye-opening for these people to hear this for the first time. and it winds up, slowly starting to move some of their decisions. With League of Women Voters, they've been a very interesting group to work with because almost every time that I've gone to a local chapter, I wind up having dinner with the mayor and, one or two city council people. So you're getting the information out that way. You're not necessarily coming from the top down telling them to do something, but you're filtering it up. Hopefully that word will spread. Now at the state level, we're doing a lot of similar things. We're going, I've made presentations, I've talked to the State Transportation Commission. I've talked to the Employment Department economists and researchers. We've talked to the Department of Land Conservation and Development, to the Oregon Planning Institute, to the Transportation Modeling Group. That's the people who sit there with the computers and build the models. And that's been a particularly critical group because what we're really trying to do with them is say, your forecasts, and I think it was mentioned over here before, your forecasts for some of these big highway projects depend on the oil price. Well, the oil price is wrong. And the oil price is driven, of course, by the supplies of oil. Now, what I've got to try to do, and one of my missions here at this conference, is to try to find what are some credible alternative models. I've got several of them and convinced right now that the models that they're using, the consultants and the models they're using, are wrong. And they know it. But I can't give them a back of the envelope, calculation and say, here, use this instead. You got to give them something credible. So one of my jobs is, finding some credible price forecasts that they can use as an alternative scenario. We've talked to the health department. Daniel had mentioned. We've talked. Lisa Dixon Gray was a member of the Portland Task Force, and we're working with them, working with the emergency management. We've talked to the economic revitalization teams. That is 9 of them within the state of leading community members and some of the agencies that are represented locally. And they have recommended that we make presentation to the governor's directors team. The directors of all the state agencies meet quarterly. So hopefully it will be on the agenda for that very soon. Made a number of other presentations, won't go through that. What are the barriers that the people face? Terry talked about it. You've got to overcome, Debbie mentioned it. What are the barriers that these people face? You've got to overcome those barriers to get through. Well, obviously they're facing other pressing matters of business. You got to break through that. There's cynicism. I've heard it before. We had it in the 70s, whatever. That's one. There's a lack of understanding. This is a key one. A lack of understanding of oil's importance. Even if you can get through a little bit about the peak oil message, they don't understand what the impact of peak oil is, or of oil going away. There's denial. There's a fear of change, a fear of loss. You have to overcome that fear. You have to get past the stage of denial. And then the last two, I think, are probably the 2 biggest barriers that the peak oil movement faces. And that is an implicit faith in technology and an implicit faith in the system. People think, even if they accept your arguments that yes, there's a peak, and I convince most people, but even if they accept the arguments that we are coming near the peak, we are at or near the peak, something's going to save us. We have a lot of good engineers. Something's going to save us. I'm not worried, Economists, prices, price signal will do it. That is the single biggest barrier to dealing with this issue, to making the hard decisions that we're going to have to make going into the future. So to overcome those barriers, first of all, you have to get your foot in the door. So how do you get your foot in the door? Well, first of all, I think you have to find a champion. You have to find a champion just like we've got up here at the table. Connecticut, Terry Backer, Representative Backer. Massachusetts, Dick Lawrence here, has taken the lead. You have to find a champion, people either from the inside or who have the connections on the inside that can make things happen. You've got, without a champion, you are barking up a tree. You have to infiltrate, and I gave, the examples there of what I was doing in terms of infiltrating, working bottom up. You have to go one-on-one. Again, we heard that, from the other speakers here. One-on-one is critical. It's not just going and making a presentation to somebody. You have to meet them for dinner. You have to go out and, separate meetings with them, one-on-one stuff. And you have to have credible advocates and supporters. To overcome the barriers, you have to have a good message content and your message style. The message content, what I present to people, first of all, you have to present sufficient evidence in some detail about the peak. You have to give the information. You can't stand up there and say the peak is happening. I've made that mistake twice, and they blow me off. where I've gone in front of a group, I have 10 minutes, and I won't do anything for, except for ASPO, for 10 minutes or less anymore. I mean, I will not go up in front of it because you cannot convince them, you cannot lay out the case and demonstrate to them that the peak is happening without sounding like some kind of a lunatic in less than 10 minutes. You just cannot do it. But you need to give them the evidence. Once they see the evidence, when I give talks to people, when they see the evidence, it is compelling. And basically, I would venture to say basically everyone I hit winds up coming away shaking their head like, holy cow, I didn't realize this was happening. You need to identify possible impacts so they know what's happening and explain the importance of oil to the economy. Then you need to chip away at the faith in easy alternatives. And that means, really talking about some things like the energy return on energy invested. They have to explain that, understand that stuff if they're going to understand that there is no simple solution here. There is no magic bullets. So you have to kind of get in and explain that. And then you have to convince them that there are intelligent responses and that they possess the capability. You have to motivate them. You have to, instill some responsibility within them because I don't possess all the answers. Nobody else possesses all the answers. This is such a big problem. Everybody's going to have to approach it. Everybody's going to have to deal with this. We are all in this boat together, and so you have to challenge them to go find some solutions rather than handing it to them on a platter. The style is very important. When you talk to people, you've got to convey seriousness about this issue, but you can't go so far as to fearmonger them. So it's a real fine line. You have to be concise. You cannot be too simple and oversimplify this issue. But on the other hand, you can't be too complex or they just roll their eyes and walk away. So there's no simple formula there. You have to avoid doomsaying. You have to leave room for hope. You have to avoid sarcasm. You have to avoid politics and ideology. You have to avoid the crunchy granola approach. There are a lot of well-meaning people in the field that are out there trying to do things, but they come across as just, simplistic answers. And, it's really if the goal, which is what you have to keep in mind, if the goal is to influence people, you have to, as we heard before, you have to speak their language. You can't go in with hidden agendas, people who have another agenda, which would be, to okay, stop it. Exactly, that's a good example. Good example. Exactly. Stop a what terminal?
LNG.
Yeah, stop an LNG terminal. If your goal is to stop an LNG terminal and you're hanging it on peak oil, you might rethink. Food policy is another one. Food is people who want, just local gardens set up, and they come in and try to hang it on peak oil. Well, that's not. It's part of the solution that we need, but it's not the solution. And you got to think bigger. You got to think a lot bigger than that. And lastly, you can't disparage global warming concerns. I've heard some people disparage global warming, say peak oil is more important. I think there's a good issue. The issues should be kept separate. There's clearly an overlap. There's clearly an interaction. You have to be aware of that. But they are our allies in this. There is so much overlap. I think they're our allies, and you cannot go in and disparage it and say that, peak oil is more important. They are critical. And I think Richard Heinberg expressed it best where he said that actions to reduce the use of oil are made necessary by global warming and inevitable because of peak oil. Skip that. What's the role of government? I think you need to be attuned to what the role of government is. First of all, it's public safety, protect citizens. Secondly, is infrastructure. Government makes a lot of decisions on infrastructure, and those are some of the key decisions that are made. They're big outlays of money, and most of them are transportation, at least for local government, probably even state government as well. Okay, my time is up. So you can read the rest of the slides. They'll be online, and I think I covered most of the important stuff. Thank you very much.
I'm an the oil drum junkie, and I read it every single morning, and much to the chagrin of my husband. But I read a lot about people banging on government this and government that, and those nasty elected officials. But there really are quite a few good people. Obviously, you can see, you've heard several here today. But there are also some in this audience that you may not know of, and some of them may rather stay anonymous. But if I could see a show of hands of those who are actually working in government, work for an agency. So look around. There are actually quite a few people who are trying to do this. One, I won't rat him out, but one is the head of a council of government, and you know, he would probably absolutely love it if his board were tuned into this issue, because he certainly gets it. So we've come a very long way since 3 years ago in Denver, a very long way. Just yesterday, my city, my very conservative city of Huntington Beach, had its first Green Expo, and the pent-up excitement was just palpable. We had, you know, tons of people there. They were all so excited. The businesses that demonstrated their products were just ecstatic to have an opportunity to connect with people in the community. So we're getting there. $4 a gallon really helps. Okay, our last speaker is Dick Lawrence, who is one of my colleagues on the board of ASPO, and he has a BS in physics. And for most of his career, he's worked for digital equipment, designing graphics, workstations, and later for Intel, developing processors for cell phones and PDAs. Dick Lawrence.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm going to try to get this thing back.
You know how to do it? Right here. I'm an Apple user. I'm a Mac user, so it's pretty amazing that.
Okay, top one, yeah.
And then F5.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Terry Backer's done an outstanding job in Connecticut, and really appreciate the work he's done. And I think it can serve as a model for anybody else who's trying to accomplish peak oil awareness and real change at the state level. So after the work Terry started in Connecticut with some help from some of the ASPO folks, I started looking at my own state of Massachusetts. And you know, we've got a lot of the right people there. We've got a lot of the right motives there, particularly after Mitt Romney left office as the governor and we got a new governor. A little background here, like Connecticut, virtually all the state's energy comes from out of state. And I don't need to go into the details here, but Massachusetts is a cold state in the winter. We have to heat the place. Most people use natural gas, some oil, liquid LPG out in the countryside. And we have a real energy supply problem. There is renewable potential, obviously, offshore wind, a lot of old dams that could be converted or reconverted to hydroelectric, and wood heat for people that got a wood lot or wood in the backyard. But the whole state, like Connecticut and other New England states, is very much at risk for large price spikes, interruptions and shortages, and finally long-term oil depletion. After we got a new governor, one thing that happened is we rejoined RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which Governor Romney, to polish his credentials as a genuine conservative, pulled us out of late in his administration. In 2008, this year, the session that ended at the end of July, we passed five major bills: the Ocean Act, Biofuels, Green Jobs Act, Green Communities, and finally the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was driven by Senator Mark Pacheco. So in the case of Connecticut, as Terry just said, he and his colleague Bob Duff were driving it from the inside. They're in the legislature. The question and the issue for Massachusetts, and maybe for your own states, is if you don't start with somebody championing this issue from the inside, can you cause that change, or can you find a champion in legislature to do that and start collaborating with them? So that was my first task. Everybody said, you will not succeed. You cannot succeed unless you find a champion in the legislature. So I started naturally with my own local senator, my region senator, said, can we set up a hearing in the State House that would bring some of our experts in this field to talk to the legislature? And so she and her staff people set that up. That was the very beginning. We did that March 31st. So we had Roger Bezdek from MISI, who many of you are familiar with, colleague of Robert Hirsch. Terry Backer and Bob Duff graciously drove up through horrible traffic to Massachusetts, Boston. John Kaufmann from Oregon, we brought him in. And finally myself, talking about ASPO and our interpretation of the energy story, where things were going. And we had about 70 attendees. We filled the room, standing room only, and we had about 20 legislators and staff people there. So I felt that was a very good start. And then, you know, everything that Terry said here is absolutely true, and in spades has to be applied when you're trying to make change, particularly at the legislative level. And June 3rd, Mark Pacheco, who, as you saw earlier, was the sponsor and chief proponent of a climate change bill in Massachusetts, organized a hearing called Running on Empty. And it was primarily about the impact of very high energy prices on the state. And so they brought in a statement from Ed Markey, the national congressman, API, oil, the Massachusetts Petroleum Council testified there. A lot of consumer concerns, the impact on trucking and small business. Like Terry was saying, the emphasis needs to be on the citizens, the impact on the economy, the impact on jobs. These are things people really care about. This is where you start to get traction. State regulation and utilities testified, and then finally recommendations by myself from ASPO and the Conservation Law Foundation. So then at the end of this, we made some recommendations, and we had a further hearing since then. The age of cheap energy is over. We need to talk about the impact on the state of very high and rising energy prices. We need to talk about the impact of the state on short-term unavailability, and finally the long-term prospect of continuing decline of available liquid fuels. And so the recommendations we made were that the state legislatures have to become informed on energy matters at the state and national level, organize a energy planning task force like Terry has with the passage of a legislative bill, and begin planning for future scenarios for price spikes, temporary shortages, and long-term reductions in all forms of energy. And what can come out of this, and the work that Terry's doing also, I think what can come out of this is a sort of a template for other states to follow. We know of Virginia, for example. Tom Whipple's wife is a state senator there. She's chairing a state task force in the legislature on energy and long-term energy security. In Minnesota, there's work going on there. California, Debbie is pushing that in the legislature in the state of California and other state agencies. So I think if anybody in the audience is thinking about doing the same thing in your state, and I hope some of you are, I would recommend, first of all, that you get the video of Terry just talking 20 minutes ago and study that and learn it and read it and see it again and again until you've got it in your brain, because it's really, really valuable and absolutely critical, everything he said. So we want to file legislation in this 2008-2009 session, a bill that would create an energy task force, a long-term energy planning task force, include representatives from the State House, both the Senate and the representatives, state agencies, transportation, which is Massport, the Turnpike and the airport, housing, education, energy and the environment, executive office, emergency services, the economy and jobs. All these things are impacted by energy prices and long-term energy shortages. So that's my presentation. Thanks very much, and I think we can take questions now.
Okay, we are going to take some questions, and I want to make, I think, there's a microphone back there. If you can line up for the questions, go ahead and take those. And I want to tell you share one more thing with you. The city of Ventura, which is just north of Los Angeles, just recently did a peak oil planning scenario. So, you know, there are cities throughout the United States, I know more of those in California, that are actually working on this and developing kind of these scenarios about how to deal with peak oil. So they run the gamut. You know, in my city, that would never happen, but we did hire an energy project manager. So, you know, you've got the two different, you know, going where people are rather than trying to foist your own issues or concerns on them. Okay, first question. And oh, and also I like to tell people to make sure they phrase their question in the form of a question, because we know the difference.
In the United States, federal transportation law says you have to plan for a highway 20 years in the future for demand, which I don't need to spell that out. Do any of you know of any community anywhere in the United States that has decided that since in 2030 there will be less oil and more expensive, that we're not going to build new highways? Because in Oregon, they're planning about $5 billion in highway widening right now.
Maybe you guys can just, does anybody know of a place that's doing that? Anybody in the audience know of a place?
There's got to be at least one. Are we at zero?
I don't think so. Oh, Terry?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
Oh,
John, let John, we'll both take a
okay.
shot at it.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at anything. The simple answer is no, I don't know of any. I mean, like I say, I'm trying to work, you know, with ODOT in Oregon. I would like to say I've made some headway. There are people at the staff level that understand, and like I say, you know, we're looking for alternative models in terms of what some of the alternative price forecasts that they could plug into their models to do that. But the simple answer is no, I don't know anybody who has really succeeded in doing that yet.
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Just quickly, you say, we know that there'll be less oil in 2030. No, they don't. So they're planning the way they've always planned. And in order to get information into their hands in a way that makes sense, that's why we took the tack we did. We create a body of information through a government process, which is always a little bit longer than you'd like, to put that in their hands to say, gee, why are we building Route 9? We won't have any cars on it in 30 years. So I think the fact is that while a lot of us think we know it, and maybe intuitively people know it, they keep waiting for the next big invention, in which case we'll be all right.
This question is first for Mayor Cook, but then I'd like the rest of the panel to jump in where they can. Around the country now, we're seeing dramatic impacts on state and local governments with oil prices where they are now. We're seeing rural counties in Texas who are suspending police services. Has anybody done a worst-case planning scenario where you say, okay, when oil reaches this level in a city, for example, take Huntington Beach, we have to cut back on X amount of sanitation, or we have to cut back on community services, and what is the food chain? How does that food chain escalate? Obviously, you keep police, fire, water, and sanitation as long as you possibly can, but has anybody looked at how the deterioration would progress throughout a city or throughout a state or a county?
Well, I've talked to my staff about that very issue, and but let me throw out a few numbers first. After kind of doing my own little audit of the community, discovered that our city, it's 200,000 people, full service, police, fire, and all of that, consumes approximately 500,000 gallons of fuel every single year. Now, let me put that in perspective, because I heard briefly this earlier in the earlier session, Jim Poplava, who said that that's about how much one destroyer uses in about a week. Just so you have that in perspective. And we do have, you know, we have our own Air Force, and we have a number of things that we could easily, you know, eliminate. Some cities are beginning to talk about putting devices in police cars, for example, to kind of keep track of what each driver is using, because we know that we can, you know, change the way we drive. We're starting to look at alternative, you know, hybrid vehicles. So, you know, you're seeing people not wanting to really change substantially how they do their business. However, we're also looking at more, you know, police officers on bicycles. I want to give you one more statistic. Our sanitation service, Rainbow Disposal, who does our work in Huntington Beach, I asked them to calculate how many gallons of fuel they use just to pick up our trash, which is 4,600 tons a week, and deliver it round trip to the dump, which is a 46-mile round trip. it was actually more gallons. It was 525,000 gallons of fuel per year to do, just to get rid of trash. So when you talk about prioritizing, you know, there's a lot of things that are going to be prioritized in that, and hopefully with our reduction in getting rid of trash, we're looking at conversion technologies so we don't have to make those round trips to dumps that are going to be closed in 2013. But, you know, at this point, you know, I think panic is the best thing that gets people working on these sort of responses, and I believe firmly that it's going to take that sort of thing before we actually, you know, unless you have a really enlightened board that wants to sit down and develop those kinds of priorities and scenarios, I don't see it happening. But I'm glad you're thinking about it.
Yeah, it's going on.
And writing about it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Anybody else want to take that? State, or are the issues different at the county or the state level than they are for a city, as they are for, you know, between big cities and smaller cities? Anybody want to jump on that?
Like I said, you're throwing out bait. I can't help but rise to it.
Good.
Certainly, it's different from, you know, from state and local government. I mean, there are things that, you know, the state government is responsible for that local governments don't handle. I mean, you know, a small city does not, you know, protect farmland. You know, they don't have jurisdiction over the farmland, you know, from where the food supply comes from. So if you're going to get food, you know, from the countryside into the cities, you're going to have, you know, state's going to have to be involved. They're going to have to work at that level. In terms of some of the emergency stuff, again, I'm working with people working on the emergency plan and trying to do, I think, exactly what you're saying, which is to say, what is the progression, the sequential progression of impacts? What we did in the Portland Task Force last year was we did kind of a big laundry list of what the impacts are, but I think the next step is, what is the sequential? Which ones unravel first? Because those are the ones you need to be able to address.
All right. Good. Thank you.
For activists, this is probably...
1 second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I would just say that we should keep in mind the possibility of nonlinear change, and that's chaos, because the longer we put this off, the less rational the response is likely to be.
For activists, this is probably one of the most important panels of the ASPO conferences, and compared to the last 3 conferences, this is by far the best, I think. And my question is, why can't we in ASPO develop a special fund to create a kit with a DVD and manuals and really get all of the arguments, all the facts in a package that we can take out? Because the times are now. I mean, we're in a period where panic is developing. The recent financial meltdown is only an indication that we are in the moment to do the kind of action that you're suggesting that we do.
Well, let me put in a plug for a sister organization, Post-Carbon Cities, which has newly published and updated their Post-Carbon Cities book, which has a lot of this kind of analysis and discussion in it.
Yeah.
And Daniel Lurch, who is one of the authors, is here, back here. You might want to hit him. And Julian.
I've got it, but I've heard some arguments
right
today that I haven't seen written down, and I'd like to have the richness of this kind of a panel in a package that all of the activists could take with them all over the world.
A lot can be accomplished with the right resources, and obviously we're kind of resource deprived ourselves. But that's an excellent idea. Thank you.
If each of us contributed $10 to this, we'd have some money.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hi. My concept relates to, my question relates to the concept John Kaufmann put out about barriers and government's duty to protect its people. I always hear talk about transportation and building products, but not pure entertainment. A lot of oil is wasted for entertainment purposes. For example, NASCAR racing, Blue Angel, lots of dipping and diving and spinning around a track. Do you have any opinion about that in the future? Is that just something you have to just like turn a blind eye to? Are you going to address that ever?
Could you rephrase that real quick? It's about the entertainment and the entertainment industry and NASCAR, what?
Yeah, oil being used for entertainment purposes, not transportation or building of products.
Right, right, okay. Fundamentally, what Portland Task Force last year said, they tried to go through what are the economic impacts. One of the key impacts is going to be people's incomes will be affected. I mean, because of recession, because of peak oil. They're going to be spending more to heat their homes. They're going to be spending more to drive. They're going to be spending more for food because of food price inflation. Something gives. They have to spend less on something, and it's going to be discretionary items. And discretionary items are going to be some of the things that you're mentioning, the NASCAR racing, tourism. You know, tourism winds up being one of the first industries hit. Those are the things that get hit first. You know, anything that depends upon discretionary income.
When we look at our energy use, one thing that we have going for us in North America is that there's pretty much a huge layer of fat between how much energy we're using and how much we actually really need for the basics of food, all those other kind of transportation things. So I think there is potentially, we can burn through a lot of that stuff before we get down to the really sort of dangerous level, but the question will be whether or not we choose to do it in a sort of socially just way. And so I see peak oil really kind of unfolding first as a kind of crisis of capitalism, but then it becomes a real social justice issue. The question is, do the rich people basically sucked up the resources and to maintain their sort of level of consumption at the expense of the poor people who are already down at that level where they're at the basic kind of survival, housing, food, those types of things. And that type of division is happening, you know, currently in the third world where there are people who can't afford $100 a barrel oil and they're cutting right down to the bone, whereas for us it's, you know, a latte less or something like that. When we look at our energy demand, there is a lot that it can move there. I think the city of Juneau, Alaska suffered an energy shortage when an avalanche took out one of their power lines and that was supplying their power. And I think the cost of energy went up 3 or 5 times almost overnight. And I think it was in the span of about a month, their electricity consumption dropped like 30 to 40%. And this was just from people turning off the TV at Walmart and all these other kind of things where we're just wasting energy gratuitously all over the place. So when we look at where's the future electricity coming from, I say, well, some of it's going to come from Nintendo power. There's all the places that we're using energy that are going to eventually have to shift to higher and better purposes, but we're going to have to figure out what's the system to allocate that, whether it's the market or the government or some combination of the two.
I'd like to use an analogy, too, back to California's energy crisis in 2001 when we had the little Enron problem. You know, it happened very quickly to us, and I think government actually responded pretty quickly to that. One of the things that happened, you know, they actually, because we didn't really know how much electricity would be produced, and you know, they were gaming the system, they were able to, you know, predict, they would have rolling blackouts, but at first the utilities didn't want to tell us where the blackouts were going to be. They didn't want the bad guys to know that this bank is going to not have lights on at this, you know, during these hours. We were able to convince them that we needed to know that so we could roll our emergency services to those areas when that happened. And they were also then able to, you know, we knew that, okay, this fire department, they're not going to have their lights turned off, and this hospital, they'll have their lights on. So it was nice to see that things happened pretty quickly, responding to an emergency, and they did it pretty thoughtfully. Next question.
Yeah, one of my activist friends is fond of saying the future will not be, the revolution will not be LEED certified. And it's kind of getting at that, I mean, nothing against the LEED, don't get me wrong. It's just a matter of, it also kind of implies a higher level of command and control than we're probably going to, it seems, some of the scenarios we're probably not going to be able to have that level of command and control. I would also argue, and my question is part of this, that for all intents and purposes, sustainability is illegal for a whole bunch of building code reasons and some economic forces, and that's another conversation. But I'm just wondering if there's any effort at the state or city level around looking at the building codes and such, and actually trying to get at how could we redesign things so that you can use less water, you're using less energy. One of my favorite ones I like to pick on, sorry John, is currently in the state of Oregon, if you want to use rainwater to flush your toilet, you have to mount a sign on the toilet saying "Do not drink." Yeah. And so, yeah.
It's for your dog.
Yeah, yeah. Usually the response is something like, "I need to train my dog how to read." So, I mean, it's not. I mean, of course, I'm sure there's some decent public safety. Apparently, in the emergency response book somewhere, it says if your water gets turned off your house, you can drink the water out of the back of the toilet. So I think that's kind of how it got going. But I mean, is there any effort trying to look at the laws around kind of seeing what just flattened the way? Thank you.
Short answer is there are.
There are a number of jurisdictions that have green building standards, and I know in British Columbia they're working on a BC Green Building Code. I think the critical thing here is the fact that incremental improvement to new buildings isn't going to get us there. If we want to have a net positive impact, we've got to have an equal emphasis on our existing building stock. Because when you look at cars, if everybody starts buying a Prius tomorrow, then in 15 years everybody's got a Prius. But the fleet of buildings turns over much more slowly. So we have to look at both doing very, very efficient new buildings, but also a fairly massive renovation and updating process for our existing building stock. And for the projects that I've been working on personally, we try and look at how do we create a net positive project so that it's not just being LEED, it's also saying let's look at how much emissions and oil dependence was in your community. When our new project goes in, we're going to have a net positive impact on emissions and oil dependence because we're doing some combination of renovation or upgrade or density or other types of things which are looking at it at the big picture scale. And so far, that type of thinking really hasn't percolated very far into the system. But there are a number of tools there that people can work with in terms of building code, policy, all these things.
Now I know we're at the witching hour, but since we don't have any, I mean the reception obviously starts now. So if you feel like you need to leave, go ahead and you can do that quietly, and we'll try to continue to take the questions.
Yeah, I want to take a shot at that too. I think that's a great question, and you laid out a pretty good scenario there. Many of our regulations are extremely energy intensive. My wife, who is not from this country, often will sit there and we'll eat dinner and she'll throw the meat on the counter on a plate, of course, and then we'll go someplace. I said, "Why are you going to put that in the refrigerator?" And she says, "You Americans, I'm surprised you've lived this long." I worked a couple of months in India, and when I came back from India, I recognized that one health inspector from my town would shut the entire country down in a week, and 1.5 billion people would then be safe. All kidding aside, a lot of the regulations obviously come down to the state legislatures, and they're created. It depends on the form of government you have in your particular state. We have no county government, so it's made at the state level, and it goes down, right? And a lot of it comes from the feds. Traffic lights or street lights, how high do they have to be? How much light has to get on the street? I think that we will see, and I've worked with my mayor on some of the things in my hometown, about regulations that they might have some control over in terms of how much energy they use. It's going to be part of, I think it's right, it's not going to be LEED certified, and it's going to be part of our future where when we had a wealth of cheap energy, we could do things. And we might have to actually rely on people to apply, I hate the word common sense, but to apply some common sense in how they do things in their lives. And lastly, I remember traveling in my wife's country where we were climbing around these old castles up in these mountains, and there wasn't one sign. I think there was one sign, and translated from Estonia, it says, "If you break your neck, it's your fault." So it's probably not true now that they're part of the European Union, but it was then. So regulations, you're going to see an impact on them because it's going to be very, very difficult to maintain those costs. A lot of the smaller mom and pop corner stores and stuff just can't even afford the energy because of our time and temperature requirements for different foods, which half of them don't even need to be what they are. So yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. There's going to be a lot of changes in that world.
A comment and a question. I'm in the water resources business here in California, and the largest energy user in California is, in fact, the pumping of water from Northern California to Southern California. It's not an issue that the water industry has looked at very closely, I can tell you. And my question is, by way of getting my question, California has spent a lot of time investing in looking at climate change scenarios. And all the future climate change scenarios right now have a net reduction in hydroelectric power as a result of shifting primarily precipitation patterns that most of you are aware of. Anybody want to comment on just that? I mean, a lot of this discussion here has been about transportation, but I'm looking for just kind of a general comment on the non-transportation infrastructure that's associated with oil. And Bryn, to you, just a comment. You made a note about depletion models. What would help my business significantly is translating that oil cost into a kilowatt per hour dollar cost, because we still use 6 cents per kilowatt hour for energy cost.
Well, I want to quickly, I know you're California and I'm California, and I served on the California Desalination Task Force, and it was interesting that their response to not enough water in California is the most energy-intensive water source you could possibly find. 5,700 kilowatt hours per acre foot of desalinated water, as opposed to something that comes from the Colorado River or north. So it's very frustrating for me that they're not doing that, although I'm sure you're aware that California Energy Commission did a really good white paper on this energy-water nexus, and you can get that online if anyone's interested in that. And maybe someone else would like to respond on this.
Rise to the bait again, all right. You raise a very good point. I mean, water is a key user. I made a talk some months ago with a high-level person who was making a presentation on global warming. And, they were running through almost the exact same scenario, and then I got up and said, well, I mean, he was turning around and then basically saying, well, you energy guys are going to obviously fix it, we'll use more natural gas or whatever, and I said, well, there's a problem there, in terms of, the future for oil and gas, and, it was really an eye-opener to them. And so we have begun some discussions with the Global Warming Commission in Oregon to kind of, again, meld efforts. I mean, that's one case where the global warming people and the peak oil people do need to talk to each other, because global warming was proceeding as if, the energy guys are just going to, develop the resources, but, you need to build into the scenario planning for your electricity production that you're going to have less hydropower, for example. And I know nuclear power is a similar situation. They've already shut down nuclear plants in Tennessee for short periods of time. In the drought last year, down in Georgia and Tennessee, an area, they ran so short of water in the rivers that they were not able to keep the nuclear plants cool, enough cooling water. And they had to shut it down for 6 weeks or something.
I'm told that this has to end because they have to set up for the next session, so let's make this the last question.